Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, the monks speak of all these grand ideas. Emptiness, dependent origination, non-duality, equanimity, the list goes on, and that is all fine and good. But what does it really have to do with day-to-day life? What about frustration, anger, anxiety, unrequited love, sadness, and grief? What is to be done about these things?
Indeed, the lofty wisdom of the monks can be difficult to translate to the grit and grime of the life of a householder. To cure this ailment, the Buddha offers this advice. It is your attachments that cause these feelings.
My attachments to what exactly?
We are all attached to feeling good and not feeling bad. However, our desires for those states of being do nothing but leave us starving for pleasure and yet also full of pain.
So we must be rid of desire?
Not quite. We must learn to be rid of being rid of things. We must shake off all desires, even the desire to have no more desires.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing the middle way, non-attachment and detachment as they function in Buddhism. I hope you enjoy. So, the big first question today is, what is the middle way?
Yeah, so the middle way is one of the central ideas in practicing Buddhism of nearly any different kind from any different sect or branch. Many people in the West feel they may be familiar with this idea because it's very popular in the self-help and New Age communities. And while this concept is mostly easy to understand, and therefore actually pretty accurately discussed in the Western New Age and self-help representations of Buddhism, I'd like to offer a little bit of nuance to the common and colloquial understanding. So, the middle way as a concept originates in the early life of the Buddha. Before he became the Buddha and was still called Siddhartha, he renounced his life at the palace and sought to find a way to overcome aging, illness, and death. Specifically, he wanted to defeat desire, which he discovered is the cause of dukkha, which we've discussed as absence of satiation. And in his spiritual practice, when he first engaged in complete asceticism, meaning he lived off of minimal food and practiced constant breath control exercises, he realized that's not that healthy. He realized that even though it helps him progress towards enlightenment, it nearly killed him. So he decided to practice something else. He needed something more. So later in his journey, he practiced hedonism. And he had experienced hedonism growing up in a palace as well. And while this was great, while he was an attractive prince, and he had access to all of these women and all of this wine and everything he could ever want, he decided that this also didn't work because it did nothing to forestall dukkha. It did nothing to forestall aging, illness, and death. And for anybody who has spent weekends or entire day-long periods drinking, they realize that it actually speeds it up a lot. It brings it right up to the next morning. And so he found that it actually enabled dukkha in a way. So he came to the conclusion eventually that the middle way between complete extremes is always the best spiritual path. This means not starving, but not indulging yourself in practice. It means moderation in behavior and in thought and in ideation. It's not avoidance and it's not decadence. It's right in the middle. The Buddha learned that practicing and believing in extremes was actually a form of attachment, or in other words, desire, and thus they were not conducive to overcoming desire. You fall right back into the trap of desire with these extremes. To that end, the middle way is non-attachment and non-duality in practice.
So, the Buddha goes through a cycle of starting in basically hedonism, going to asceticism, going back to hedonism for a little while, and then ending up in the middle is basically how it went?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a pretty reasonable approach to things. I'm not a centrist. There's a lot of points where I think that the extremes are worth at least investigating, but in day-to-day life, this seems like a just wise way to go about things. The idea of wanting less was kind of a revelation for me when I was starting with Buddhism, and it's that idea is I started with meditation, as we mentioned in the first episode, but the idea of being free of desire is the part that made me stay, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think that non-attachment is, like I said, since it's fairly simple and easily understood, it's very well represented. And I think that it has been one of the more helpful things that Western New Age mindfulness and self-help communities have taken up and presented to these audiences, because like you say, it prevents you from wanting too much. It prevents you from getting carried away by day-to-day things. And it just helps you understand that you deliberately choose your path in the middle of these extremes. And it's important that you did bring up centrism in this context, because the question that the Buddha often gets and that people often pose in response to the middle way is, well, extremes are relative. So how do we know if we're in the middle way if we don't know the full landscape, right? How do we know that we're east or west if we don't know where the oceans are? And the response to that is that there are actually some very concrete extremes. Starving and complete decadence and indulgence and gluttony are two concrete extremes because they have very real life effects on your body, and each one brings you closer to death. And another example is spending your entire life and your entire day full of negative feelings, depressive feelings, anger, grief, sadness, all of these poor, horrible feelings, or trying to spend your entire day full of euphoria. Both things are unsustainable, and both things are more or less impossible. And so the middle way is a way to also mention about the world and discuss about the world how you can't live in one extreme forever, because the world oscillates back and forth. Life oscillates back and forth. And when you start to understand and meditate on that, you actually start to realize that the middle way is in part a prescription of behavior, but in another part, it's also a mindfulness tool to take things in stride, so to speak.
So we've already used a lot of specific terminology. I'm going to start drilling down into those. So one of the words we've used a lot is non-attachment. So what is non-attachment?
It's important that we talk about that, because non-attachment is a very broad and lofty concept. But in practice, it means not to let anything that one senses, meaning not to let anything that one sees, smells, touches, tastes, smells, or thinks, cause feelings of desire, because desire leads to suffering. So I'll say that one more time to drive the point home. Not to let anything of the senses, including mind, cause feelings of desire, because desire leads to suffering. Sentient beings are often attached to pleasure and pain. They desire pleasure, and they desire the absence of pain. This totally shapes our behaviors and our worldview. It's coded into our very biology. And so because of that, everything we do, think, feel, believe, and say is related to a desire for pleasure and a desire for no pain. So until we make a deliberate change, this is the default state of our brains, of all animals, of all sentient beings. So let's say that we do make that change. We decide that, like the Buddha, we're going to overcome desire. The Buddha would offer us a word of caution from his own experience. Do not become attached to non-attachment. It is possible to become attached to being enlightened. It's possible to desire for enlightenment and thus suffer. This happens very often with people who train and monks who are seeking enlightenment.
I will say that I've seen this happen to people online as well. Like, this is not just to monks, this is to anyone. Like, it's totally possible to... Like, the desire to have no desire is kind of self-defeating. So...
Absolutely.
One has to find the right balance, I suppose.
Absolutely. And you see how this is directly related to the middle way, because you can desire for enlightenment really strongly, or you can desire for the absence of suffering really strongly, and you're caught in a duality, and you're suddenly trapped by your desires in this lack of satiation. So on this subject, one of my favorite Zen scholars from Japan in the 1200s, who is named Dogen, we'll discuss more about him in the future, but he writes about this exact topic. He says, "In attachment, blossoms fall, and in aversion, weeds spread. When you stop grasping after it, it fills your hands." And I think that this quote exemplifies non-attachment in a very good way, because in this case, blossoms, they're symbolizing the absence of dukkha. And in aversion, weeds spread. Weeds are symbolizing desire, attachment, and things that lead to dukkha. When you stop grasping after it being enlightenment, awakening, cessation, whatever you're grasping after, it fills your hands. Imagine trying to grab and hold water instead of just drinking it. You can't do that. It goes through your fingers. You can't hold down water. You can either just let it flow, let it sink, let it do what it does. You can't grasp after it. And then it'll fill your hands. And I think that this exemplifies non-attachment.
Going further into that water model, you can just scoop water up with your hands. The problem is grasping, not necessarily trying to hold it. It's the way you do it.
Exactly.
All right. So, this is something I have had trouble with as well. So, how is non-attachment different from detachment?
This is very important too. So I want to start by giving a quick definition of how I understand detachment, and then we'll dive into the difference. For me, detachment is not feeling strongly about anything, not emotionally investing or even mentally investing in things that happen to you or around you, or things that happen far away from you, just in general, things that you know about, things that you sense. And this is close to what we want to get to, but it's not quite it. And here's why. According to the Buddhist textual tradition, detachment and non-attachment are not the same thing. In order to greater explain the difference, I'd like to start with an analogy that's commonly used in this context. So often when discussing mindfulness, it's said that we should imagine that we are sitting on the grass on a sunny day, looking at the sky, and our thoughts and feelings and the things that happen to us and around us are like passing clouds. They're fleeting, they come and go, nebulous and mercurial, etc. This is a great way to start understanding meditation and non-attachment. In this analogy, if one imagines themselves as the observer on the grass and their thoughts are like passing clouds, I think of that as detachment. So you see your thoughts, you're aware of them, they come and go. It's not unhealthy to be this way. It's actually a good start to get from being terribly attached to being in an experience of non-attachment. So you're the observer. When one imagines themselves as the sky through which the clouds pass, I think of that as non-attachment, because you're not attached to yourself as the observer, and you don't think of the clouds as yours. You start to see how this is a little bit different in a very subtle but important way. I think of imagining yourself as the sky as non-attachment. When one is getting carried away with each passing cloud and is getting jerked around by all these thoughts and feelings, that's attachment. That's not what you want to have in your daily life and in your mindfulness. When one is watching as though they are separate from what they're watching, they are detached. The subtle point there is that they're imagining themselves as separate from their thoughts and feelings and the things that happen. Attachment and detachment, though, are a duality, and the Buddha teaches non-duality. He would come in and teach that one doesn't watch, but instead experiences as though there is no separation. And that's the experience of non-attachment. The sky and the clouds, they're not separate from each other. They happen in and to each other. They're all the same thing. And to that end, the middle way is non-attachment. It's not attachment. It's not detachment. It's not the absence of detachment or attachment. Instead, it's just non-attachment. It's presence to and oneness with experience, but freed from desire and in a place of equanimity instead of separation, instead of extremes. instead of attachments, instead of lack of satiation.
So we could perhaps rephrase detachment as apathy, it sounds like.
That's how I would interpret it in some ways,
Okay.
yes.
So when I first suggested this episode, I used the word detachment and did not realize that I was not quite in the right terminology. As I was coming to figure out detachment and cessation of desire in my own mind, I had a lot of trouble with this. So what are some ways we can perhaps recognize when we've found detachment when we were looking for non-attachment? What are some signs that we've fallen into apathy rather than a lack of desire?
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked that, because there is a practical aspect to this with some concrete feedback that you can experience as the meditator, as the experiencer, etc. So detachment is a very short trip away from depression and a very short trip away from fatalism. If detachment, if we can define it and think of it as apathy, then fatalism and nihilism are direct implications of that. And we've spoken before about how nihilism and fatalism are complete misinterpretations of what the Buddha is saying. Another way to explain the difference between an experience of non-attachment and detachment is in terms of the emptiness of experience versus the fullness of experience. I'd like to caution you not to think of emptiness, the term we've talked about before, in this analogy. This is something that I'm coming up with that's not based on the scriptures, but it is based on the religious studies terminology that we use to talk about salvation. The big academic words we use are apophatic and cataphatic salvation. Emptiness of salvation would be if we don't feel anything and we don't think anything and we don't do anything. That's emptying our experience in order to achieve salvation. Instead, I think that the Buddha would propose more of a fullness of experience type of salvation. So to rid yourself of attachments does not mean to throw away everything you own, and does not mean to cut off every relationship you've ever had and all of that stuff. It actually means to change your approach to those things and to stop seeking for certain outcomes one way or the other in those things. So instead of saying, I'm going to become enlightened, I'm going to get rid of everything I own and not talk to anyone else and not have any friends or family or anything like that, the truth is that that's not reality. Everyone has families and relationships. Everyone has stuff at one point or the other. Everyone needs stuff at one point or the other for shelter. They need food. They need all kinds of things to live and be healthy. And the Buddha already tried this. He tried the asceticism. He tried the starvation because he was looking for the emptiness of experience. And he realized you don't need to change your life in that direction to experience the emptiness of experience. Rather, you need to change your approach to life, change your approach and your perspective, and rather feel the awakening that one can feel whenever they have insight into the true nature of their experiences, rather than trying to rid themselves of their experiences altogether. It's a very subtle point, and I hope that it's coming across, because fullness of experience in this case doesn't mean hedonism either. Fullness of experience doesn't mean you have to throw yourself fully into every single sense-based experience. It means that you are letting things happen to you and steering your own experience from a place of, I'm not going to let myself get carried away from wanting a certain thing with this experience, or I'm not going to try and extract something. All of the I am, or I will, or I want, or I can or cannot, all of the I sentences start to fall away. And that's the important thing, because of the actual teaching of emptiness, because of non-self. The important thing is that if you can understand non-self, then you're defeating desire, because you have to have a self to desire things for that self. And if you can reach beyond selfhood and into non-self, then you start to realize that experience is happening, and you're starting to realize the non-arising of all dharmas that we've mentioned before. In that sense, you're not actually changing that much about your behaviors necessarily. You can, but ultimately, I don't think that you have to go live on a mountain to become enlightened. I don't think you have to throw away friends and family and things. I think that it's much more meaningful and important for us in this modern age to instead switch our perspective and our approach to our relationships with these things and people.
So let's talk a bit about next episode. We are going to talk about the major schools of Buddhism. How do they differ? What kind of rituals do they do? And similar questions to that.
Thank you. Hope to see you there. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.